Everybody, good morning. Good morning, good morning. This is a lot fancier of a setup today than we usually have for this class. We've got table settings and everything in here. Thank y'all for being here. I'm really excited about today because today we're talking about the absolutely not at all charged topic, politics. Okay? So I'm just forewarning you, that's today's session, because there is a chapter on it, and I did think, because I'm the one who's figuring out what we're going to do week to week, I could conveniently skip it. But then I thought, that doesn't seem, I don't know, that just seemed kind of weaselly. So I said, you know what, we're going to do the hard thing, and we're going to talk about it, we're going to include it. So today's session of this class, which is session 5 of 6, will be on politics, the seculosity of politics. And then next week, we'll conclude this study. We will do this on Palm Sunday. We won't have Sunday school on Easter Sunday, but Palm Sunday we will. And we'll conclude by talking about two things. What happens when seculosity comes to church, okay? Because we've been talking about, right, the whole premise of the book and the title of the book. And this word that the author made up, seculosity, all has to do with what happens when we turn other pieces of our life into capital R religion, right, or a replacement for it. So you may think, oh, well, the church is immune because we are capital R religion, right? So we can't fall prey to this. But actually, the last chapter of the book is called Jesus Land, and it talks about what happens when seculosity comes to church. We'll talk about that and then kind of what we do about all of this, what we do about all that we've talked about. Because we've talked about a lot over these sessions. We've talked about the ways in which technology fuels our sense of being enough, the ways that technology allows us to measure more stuff than we could ever measure about ourselves before, how many friends we have, likes we have, how many steps we take, what our sleep cycle looks like. We can measure all of that, right? And it gives us all of these different metrics to compare ourselves to other people that we never had before. And this can turn into a pretty graceless cycle of self-deprecation and frustration because we're never able to be the kind of people that we want to be. And we talked about how this kind of infects a lot of areas of our lives, from our relationships to our parenting to work and busyness and how we define who we are by what we do and how good at it we are. I mean, we've talked about how this kind of makes its way everywhere. So today, as I mentioned, we get to the seculosity of politics. Okay, the seculosity of politics. Before next week we talk about the seculosity of the church. Okay. So I just want to remind us, because this is a made-up word, seculosity, right? It's based on this book by David Zoll, who, as I mentioned last week, each week I kind of introduce him to you, but then I was told by somebody that he came and preached here at least one time. So he's no stranger to here. Yeah, we got to get him back. And he's about to come out with, well, that may be what it feels like, come out with another book here very shortly that looks really, really good. And I'm very interested in maybe even doing a study on that with y'all. It's a little more church-themed. But anyway, so this word seculosity he comes up with is a catch-all for religiosity that's directed horizontally rather than vertically at earthly rather than heavenly objects. Okay, and I want us to remember this definition as we talk today about politics, which is a very horizontally oriented thing usually, right? It's all about the world and how we organize it and how we relate with one another through that organization, right? How we group ourselves and run ourselves, basically. Okay. So let's talk about this to set the stage for today. And I do actually have slides that summarize today. So I'm going to put up my little points here. Y'all can read those as I go. So David Zoll begins this chapter by actually telling a story from a Seinfeld episode. Okay, an episode of Seinfeld where the two of the characters are because how many people watch Seinfeld before I do this? Okay, it's a show about nothing, right? Some people love it. Some people think it's just, why watch it? But anyway, they're trying to find someone to marry or date or whatever in this show. And there's an episode where one of the characters finds out that some guy that she's wanting to date has a different political opinion about something than her, and this is seen as like, oh, she can't date him anymore. And that's the joke in the show, is that she can't date him anymore, because at the time, that would have been seen as, and that time was like 1996, okay? So like not that long ago. But that was just seen as like, why would you not date somebody solely because they have a different political opinion than you? But actually now, that's a pretty common thing. That's seen as a deal breaker, actually, if someone's politics differ from yours. And David Zoll says that according to every metric available, our society has never been more divided by politics. Now, I actually think that's a bit of an overstatement, because at one point we did like fight a war with each other. So I would say that was probably, we were a little bit more divided over politics in the middle of the 1800s than we are now. But for as long as we've been able to do social science studies on people's opinions and attitudes towards things, okay, I would say that we certainly are more divided now than we have been in recent memory, at least in the last century or so. We are less likely than ever before, he says, to have friends who vote differently from us, and we are more likely to choose where we live based on how our neighbors vote. In the late 1950s, when American parents were asked how they would feel if their child were to marry someone from another political party, fewer than 10% indicated that it would be a problem for them, okay? By 2010, that number had more than quadrupled to 40%. And David Zoll writes, God only knows what it would be today, because that was a decade ago, right? 2010 was 12 years ago, somehow. But yeah, so, and things have, I would venture to say we'd all agree things have probably not gotten less polarized since 2010, right? So that's wild, 10% to 40% plus. David Zoll writes that with the possible exception of career, politics has become today's most popular replacement religion, and it's certainly the one with the most forward momentum and cultural currency. For many, its substitution for capital R religion has been seamless and hardly even noticeable. He said, if once upon a time we looked to politics primarily for governance, we now look to it for belonging, righteousness, meaning, and deliverance. In other words, all of the things for which we used to rely on capital R religion. He says, understanding politics in this way is the key not only to surviving our increasingly fractured world, but to finding compassion for those in its thrall, including ourselves. Okay, this is how David Zoll sets up this chapter. And I don't really think that his kind of his depiction of where we are culturally around this is inaccurate. I think he's kind of describing it rather well. Okay. So our divides are deep, right? Our divides are deep. That's kind of, to summarize slide 1, okay? Our divides are deep. That's the problem. So, before we continue with this, there is an important disclaimer. And David Zoll goes to great lengths in this chapter to talk about this, and I think this is really, really important, okay? Like every other thing in the book so far that he's mentioned, he says politics is not inherently bad, okay? It's an important thing to remember. Just like technology is not bad, parenting, certainly not bad, work, not bad, okay? These are not inherently bad things. But what happens is when we look to them as our self-justification narratives, that's when they start to go off the rails, okay? He says politics is not inherently bad. It is just a necessity of life, right? After all, politics simply refers to the systems of governance and the power dynamics inherent to them that we have, right? Not even just country or nation has a politics. Every church has politics, right? A polity. Right? We have a way of governing ourselves. In the Episcopal Church, that looks like a convention every 3 years called General Convention, where we gather together delegates from all across the church, and there's 2 houses. There's the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops, and we hash things out, and we vote on stuff, and all that kind of thing, and that happens every 3 years. And then in between, each diocese has its own annual convention or council where delegates from each parish go. That's our politics, right? That's our politics. It's just the way that we organize ourselves. And so he says that we need to remember that it just is. Politics just is. But what we do with it and how it plays out in our life together can be very tricky. He talks about a time when he used to identify himself as being apolitical, okay, apolitical. And he writes about that when he was in college and friends would talk about politics, he would claim that he was apolitical, which by that he meant that he didn't align with either political party, okay? But he writes that he no longer says that, not because he's had some sort of like deep political awakening or something like that, but because today to claim that you're apolitical means that you believe yourself to be a person whose life isn't informed or shaped by politics and its power dynamics, that you somehow float up above the politics in which we live. But no one does that, right? Nobody floats above it. We're all in it somehow. And so he talks about how no one is apolitical in the same way that no one is acultural or a-religious. If you are alive, you are those things, but the only question is how, okay, is how. And he says the seculosity of politics is what happens when the political becomes not one lens among many for understanding the world. For instance, a metaphysical lens for understanding the world, a psychological lens for understanding the world, spiritual lens for understanding the world, but it becomes the only lens, or the only lens that really matters. He says this is when you start to get into the seculosity of politics. And he mentions that regardless of how we've gotten to our current division and divisiveness, the end result of it is a world in which just about everything is politicized somehow, and that creates a lot of fatigue. I don't know if you feel this, okay? But he mentions it's not just how you vote, it's also how you shop, how you eat, how you socialize, how you vacation, and even how you worship can be read now and is read sometimes through a political lens by people, right? So that if you go to, I don't know, you go to Chipotle instead of McDonald's. This is not just because you wanted a burrito and not a hamburger. It's now sort of a statement about the way that you vote or view the world or whatever, right? Does anybody feel this? Has anyone experienced this? Yes. It's exhausting, okay? And he says that while it is possible to ascribe power dynamics to each one of those pursuits and to draw out broader social implications, like for instance, the way we shop does have an implication, right? You know, this shirt that I'm wearing now, these pants that I'm wearing now, they were made somewhere by somebody, probably not in the best of conditions, and that's real, right? That's a real thing. So he's not saying, the same thing with food. Where we buy and source our food does have ethical and moral implication, and that's important. Right? There is a power dynamic to each one of those, but he says that the suggestion that there are plenty of other ways of explaining human behavior besides politics, some of them potentially more profound, seems increasingly in our modern age heretical, right? Like how would you suggest that something else may be at play other than pure raw politics, okay? So, there's that. And it's also important to note, as David Zoll does, okay, I will give him a lot of credit here, and I think this is important, that the way that we vote, the policies and the political parties that we vote for, the power that they wield, David Zoll does say those things are consequential. It's not as if politics is sort of a theoretical disembodied pursuit, right? Policy does have an impact on like real people's lives, okay? So he's not trying to say, again, that somehow he's floating up above politics, but rather that we're all in it and that how we vote does matter. It does have consequence. It is, and that those things are really important, right? The reason that we vote and that what motivates us to go to the polls are our deepest convictions, right? They're not things that we hold lightly. Okay, at least they shouldn't be anyway, right? Because it is a big responsibility in this country to be able to elect your representative leaders and those sorts of things. And he acknowledges that. He doesn't want us to think that somehow he's just dismissing politics as like, well, people just need to get over themselves and whatever, right? He acknowledges that the reason we vote the way that we do is because and out of our sense of conviction and responsibility, and those things are important. So he doesn't dismiss those things, but he wants to say up front that we need to acknowledge it, okay? He also admits that there are a lot of problems in our world that can actually be solved by political means, right? I mean, that, again, policy has real-world implication and impact. So there are some things that we face in the world that can be solved by political means, but he says that not every problem can be solved that way. And he writes, indeed, we run into the limits of politics when we seek political solutions to internal problems. Problems like hubris, pride, lust, grief, sin, and evil. These things, right, they cannot be solved merely through legislation, okay? That politics is important, but it has its limits. Okay. All right. Okay, we're doing good on time. There are discussion questions today, believe it or not. I did even leave those in. But anyway, so there's an important disclaimer as we continue, okay, that politics are important. They do have real-world implication. It's not somehow that he's just like, you know, it doesn't matter. It's inconsequential. Okay, so let's talk about this. A big part of his chapter here on politics features a social or a moral psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, who actually, I've read this book that he references. He pulls from a book called The Righteous Mind, okay? And it's a really good book. I recommend it. It is academic. Jonathan Haidt is himself an academic researcher, but it's really interesting. Came out, I can't remember how long ago now, probably 15 years maybe. You can buy it in paperback at like Book People downtown. That's where I bought my copy. But it's a really interesting and very good book. And Jonathan Haidt in this book talks about how humanity, not just humanity now, but just humanity in general for all time, has formed its sense of moral righteousness. Hence the name A Righteous Mind, okay? And it's a really, I think his argument's very compelling, okay? So what he does is he tells stories and narratives shape our moral grounding, okay? This is kind of the basic argument of Jonathan Haidt's book, is that the way that we derive our strongest convictions and sense of right and wrong comes that we put around certain values that impart them with meaning. Some of these narratives we're kind of conscious of, like we know that we have them, but some of them are things that are almost subconscious. Like they come out in times of strife, but so they're there, but we're not conscious or aware that we even have these narratives, but they're there informing how we view right and wrong. So he calls this moral foundations theory, okay? And it comes from his book, The Righteous Mind. I already said that. Okay, so moral foundations theory, what is it, okay? He says that we instinctually seek righteousness. That this is a fundamental human impulse, is to seek righteousness. We don't just want to do good or whatever, we want to be right. Okay, we want to be righteous, morally upright. He says that it's core to the human experience. And he lays out 6 foundations, which he likens to moral taste buds. Okay, this is kind of what he says. That everybody throughout all time has these 6 axes, basically, that they on which they plot their moral righteousness. Care and harm, fairness and cheating, liberty and oppression, loyalty and betrayal, authority and subversion, and sanctity and degradation. Okay? And each of these foundations appears across epochs and cultures, and where we locate ourselves on each of these axes will depend on both our predisposition as well as our context. It also serves as a pretty reliable predictor of how people vote, how people parent their children, what kind of church people attend or don't, as well as how we get along with those who differ from us. Okay? So just as an example, if you're kind of like, how does this work in practice? So let's talk about authority and subversion. We'll just pull that one out, okay? So what you feel about respecting authority versus what you think about not respecting it, and internal righteousness meter pings is different in different people, right? So there are some folks, you maybe want, where respect for authority is incredibly important, right? And even if the authority may not be exactly doing the right thing, what's important is that you respect it, right? And if someone violates that respect, that really gets to you, because that is a violation of this kind of intense, almost innate sort of moral reasoning that you have, right? There are others, though, who think that, yeah, I'll respect authority, but they've got to earn it, right? I'm not just going to respect them out of principle. And so if someone in authority does something that they don't agree with, they see it as morally righteous not to respect them, right? And the thought of respecting authority at all cost actually is what grinds their gears and is just like, ooh, gives you heartburn, you know? And I can see in looking around, there are some people who are like yes to one and to the other, right? And so but that's how this works in practice, okay? So you could kind of take each of these, care and harm, loyalty, betrayal, same thing. For some people, loyalty at all costs is an absolute moral, righteous thing, whereas other people, again, it's, anyway, sanctity, degradation, same thing. Do you treat holy things with respect versus are you an iconoclast and you see that it's morally righteous to push against what has formerly been revered so that you can do a new thing, right? We've all experienced these things in our life in some way. But these are the six foundations that Jonathan Haidt talks about in his book. And David Zoll writes that as relates to our current political landscape, liberal conceptions of righteousness consist almost exclusively of care, fairness, and liberty. So Jonathan Haidt kind of, again, it's a book of social science, right? So he's done these studies. And folks who are identify as political liberals, care, fairness, and liberty are the three top values. And the narratives of righteousness that they have consist of those three things, and those three things trump everything else, like override everything else. They need to care for other people, it needs to be fair, and people's freedom needs to be respected, okay? And those things are above all else. Whereas conservatives, when he polled, all six, yeah, I invented one just then. All six of the things had to be in place. So respect for authority, loyalty, all of that tempers those other three for conservative voters, okay? And so he talked about how those lead to certain divisions in our common life. David Zoll writes that divisions arise when people seek differing forms of righteousness. In fact, we might not even recognize the other's concerns as righteous at all. And this is kind of what I just said in my example about authority. Jonathan Haidt notes, for instance, that when he speaks to liberal audiences about conservative moral foundations like loyalty, authority, and sanctity, those are all really important, who identify themselves as conservative voters, he finds that many in the audience don't just fail to resonate with these things, they actively reject these concerns as actively immoral themselves. So loyalty to a group is seen as shrinking the moral circle and making it smaller, which can be the basis of racism and exclusion. So that's seen as kind of not a good thing. Authority becomes seen as oppression, and sanctity is seen as kind of religious mumbo-jumbo, like, again, why would you sort of hold to these things? Anyway, and so it goes very quickly from being seen as maybe a moral difference it goes from being a moral difference to rather an us versus them dichotomy very quickly, right? So the whole grounds for mutual understanding very quickly gets eroded when these things butt up against one another. And Zoll's argument is that we are all actively identified with moral narratives that we have a very large stake in being true. These narratives are never just stories, they are justifying stories. And if they weren't morally justifying stories, we wouldn't get so upset when they are threatened, right? These upset our very sense of right and wrong. They're not just differences of opinion or something like that, right? So these shared stories and the moral foundations that underpin them create powerful, powerful communities of belonging for those who share in the same justifying narratives. And I've at least seen, and I would bet that y'all see too, that politics have functioned more and more in this way as we become more and more siloed and more partisan, that these communities are incredibly strong because they share narratives. And more commonplace not to have individual policy opinions, like, well, I've got, I think that we should do this on energy or this on national defense or whatever. But rather, you don't have individual policy opinions, but instead you are aligned with a team or another team. David Zoll writes about it this way. He says, in fact, it's telling that where once we had political opinions, we now are expected to have a politics. As in, what are your politics, right? Not what is your opinion on this or that, but it's what are your politics. It sounds an awful lot, David Zoll says, like what people in church mean when they talk about someone having a theology. What code dictates your life, and how does it stack up to my code? They're trying to figure out whether or not you belong. And I have to say, I see this all the time in the life of the church. Where folks are unfortunately dismissed on what perceived tribe they align with. And a narrative is constructed and used to dismiss and demean other people. It's weaponized against them. Oh, you're a liberal or you're a conservative. And there's this whole constellation of things that's just assumed about you in that moment, and it's used to easily push you aside. No one can, I'm sure no one else has observed that in the life of the church, right? No one? Now, what this does, right, is nuance and the fullness of one's humanity ends up not mattering in this. And I think that's very, very unfortunate. And it's very, very easy to do this, to construct that dichotomy and say, well, that person's not on my team. I don't need to listen to what they have to say. And they're not going to listen to me either, so why bother, right? But the reality of our lives and our lived experience is actually not like that at all. And I think, this is me now, this is not David Zoll or Jonathan Haidt, but this is me. I think this is actually an unfortunate byproduct of a system in which we really only have two major political parties. Because it means that no matter how nuanced your view on like a whole range of issues may be, when you step into that voting booth, you basically have two choices. Right? And so each of us, if we were to sit down, and we're not going to do this in discussion, but if we were each to sit down and just talk about what you think about a variety of issues, my guess is they wouldn't map neatly on, one party platform or another party or something. Now, there may be more that align with one and more that align with another or something like that, but we're all complex people, right? I think so anyway. I think we're all complex people. And we have a lot of different views on a lot of different things. But if there are only really two viable choices when you step in to vote, that's what you got to do. And it's going to take this really rich tapestry of difference here, and it's going to segment it into two piles at the end, right? And I think that's just an unfortunate byproduct of our current political system that it does that. Anyway, and one of the things that I thought a lot about when I was reading this chapter and kind of preparing my remarks for today is how this, what this means for our common life at St. Richard's, because as I've mentioned in our annual meeting back at the beginning of the year and was very clear to me during the search process, is one of the strengths of this place was that it was a place of that is not theologically or politically homogenous, right? And that was seen and stated in the parish profile as a real strength. That this was a place where we came together around the truth of the gospel and our love for Jesus, and that it was a place where we could set aside our differences for a little bit. And I think, and I said this at annual meeting, and I still hold to it today, that doesn't mean, per this chapter, right, that doesn't mean that our differences don't matter, and it doesn't mean that our convictions don't matter. But I think that one of the most important witnesses that this place can have in a world where this doesn't happen very often is to be a place where we can together, like in a healthy and constructive way, and not in a like we barely tolerate each other way, right? But in a way where we genuinely are joined in the bonds of love and affection and Christian charity. I think that could be a huge and profound witness to a world where it's very divisive and bad out there, right? We all live in that. So anyway, so I was thinking about that a lot when I was reading this, this chapter. To be a place where we seek mutual understanding, to be a place where we don't view our neighbors as our enemies. I seem to remember somebody in the New Testament talking about that. I don't know. But anyway, I sincerely believe nothing can be more countercultural in our world in this moment than that. I genuinely think so. Okay, so our righteous minds. These are the sort of 6 ways that we, or moral taste buds that we all have. That when we encounter difference, these things are often the play. So let's talk about grace and politics. Because like every single chapter, David Zoll ends up talking about grace. Spoiler alert for next week, that's what we're going to talk about then too, okay, is what does grace have to do to bust up in all of these ways that we've replaced a religion of grace? I mean, Christianity is that, right? That is the central, proclamation of the gospel is God's great love and mercy for us. So what does grace have to do with all of this that we've been talking about? So David Zoll had some quotes in here that were just like, I even wrote in my notes, amen, with a big exclamation point after it. And one of them is this one that comes from page 158. I even put it in the slide. Okay, he writes that the gospel of Jesus Christ is not an improved ideology to adopt or to foist upon others. It's not a system, but a message addressed to those who have failed to live up to their principles about the God who meets people in their need and not in their virtue. Ooh, I love that. Meets us in our need and not our virtue. What binds its adherents together is not common righteousness, but shared weakness. Not common righteousness, but shared weakness. I was like, yes. Oh. That's good. That'll preach, as they say. Okay? But this attitude, also known as grace, does not negate or invalidate our political convictions or ethical stances, he writes. Instead, it allows us to hold them more gently and more honestly with one another. Right? Grace permits us to see both others and ourselves as we are, flawed people who do not have all the answers, and who should be suspicious of those who seem to think that they do. We are much more likely to work to improve our neighbor's welfare when we no longer see them as an obstacle to some utopia. When we see our neighbor instead as a lot like us, desperate to belong, but caught up in narratives that divide them from others and themselves. Jesus is, quote, not the Messiah we would elect, but the one who elects us. Again, that'll preach. That's really good. That's not my line, that's David Zoll's, so I'll give it to him. But man, not the Messiah we would elect, but the one who elects us. Yes, 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 yes. Okay? And so in summation, because I do want to leave us time for discussion, we've got some questions. In summation, politics are important. They are how we organize our life together. They do have real-world impact. People's lives, including our own, are impacted by them. We all live in them. But they alone cannot save us, right? And if we're not careful, they become means by which actually we further divide ourselves and undermine the very truth and veracity of the gospel and Jesus' witness to us and call to us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. As if somehow the neighbors next to us are our enemies who are persecuting us. I think that's really the most insidious thing, right? Is that the way that our political division works right now is that it creates enemies out of neighbors, right? It ruins Thanksgivings for everybody, you know? And so I think, I mean, it sounds maybe overly simplistic, but actually I think the solution is simple in theory and ultimately challenging in practice, that to inject more grace into every aspect of our lives, including our politics and the way that we relate with one another is absolutely crucial and critical, and a big part of what I think our witness as Christians is supposed to be in our current life together. Okay, so there we go. Discussion questions. So here we are. Here's what we have, and I've got just a couple today. These are big questions, and I want us to lay some ground rules before this, right? Like, let's not make any assumptions about our neighbors, first of all. Second of all, let's discuss each of these questions in charity, okay? If someone says something, for instance, in answering one of these that makes you go, and you can feel your blood pressure rise just a little bit, think about it, right? And think about maybe which of those 6 taste buds, what are those things that are being violated in that moment? Like what narrative is being violated in that moment? And then just kind of pause and breathe and keep going. Neither of these questions, there's only 2. Neither of these questions really ask anything. I'm not going to be like, share with your neighbor every stance you have on a hot button issue. Okay, that's not what we're going to do this morning, but just want to lay down some ground rules to be extra charitable with each other this morning as we answer these. So the first question is, have you experienced political affiliation? So not disagreement on an issue, okay? So not like you're talking about, I don't know why you would ever talk about this, but like you're talking with a friend about monetary policy, and you have different ideas about it. I'm not talking about that, okay? I'm talking about, have you ever experienced political affiliation come between you and a friend or family member? How did it feel? And have you experienced an event that helped you overcome partisan lines to establish a more human connection with somebody? Okay? So that's question number 1. So we're going to take a few minutes now and discuss that, and then we'll move to question 2. All right. Well, I hope y'all had some good conversation at your tables. I didn't see anyone get up and storm away or throw a chair or anything. So I think we're, my bar of success is we're meeting it. Okay, we're meeting it right now. I also will say about this too, I should have actually said this at the beginning, but I hadn't had enough coffee yet to remember to say this. But, I think whenever you discuss politics in general and the intersection with politics and the church, politics and theology, how our faith impacts the way that we, the way that we vote or something like that, there's just absolutely, I kind of skimmed over the surface of this chapter because the interplay between those two things is actually immensely complicated. And it's very difficult in a 25-ish minute little rundown of a chapter from a book to kind of touch on all of the different ways that our convictions, theological, whatever, impact the way that we live, right? Because the way that you establish those convictions has everything to do with the way that you read Scripture, right? So that's there. The way that you understand the teachings of the church. And then sometimes just your own experience and the way that has helped you, has helped form and shape some of your moral character, right? And all of those different things and more are at play anytime we talk about the convictions that we hold and why we hold them. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about, our faith and its intersection with politics. And that's just such a complex thing that's hard to really disentangle in just one 25-minute thing. And so there's so much more that could be said about all of this than we've gotten to today, obviously. But I've appreciated y'all kind of humoring me as we've explored some of the major themes that are there in David Saul's chapter. Okay, so let's go to this next question here. I know this is a lot of text, okay, but the question is actually kind of simple. So thinking about Jonathan Haidt's research arguing that our moral values are based on often subconscious and unarticulated stories, right? These narratives, moral narratives that we create or are created for us in some cases. Which of his 6 moral foundations, care, harm, fairness, cheating, liberty, oppression, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, degradation, so which of those speak most forcefully to you or resonate most deeply with your own sense of moral conviction? Which of these are most outrageous to you when they are violated? And can you articulate why? So does that make sense? Like, which of these sort of 6 things inform most acutely your own sense of moral righteousness? And often the way that you know is actually the second part of this question of which of these is most outrageous to you when violated. That's often an indication that that's like one of the most important to you, right, in forming your moral foundation or sense of right and wrong. So which of these kind of resonate with you? For instance, when someone is not fair, you feel like everything really needs to be fair, and when it's not, that just, that drives you nuts. You know what I mean? You just have hives, okay? When something's not fair. Think about those things and share some of those at your table, and see which of these do you identify with most strongly, which is most outrageous to you and violated, and can you articulate why? Why is that something that, when violated, just... Because often, the things that we hold most dear, morally speaking, when you ask, well, why is it so outrageous to you that it's violated, it's so easy just to say, well, it's just wrong, you know, because it feels that way, right? Well, it's just wrong. It just is not right. But see if you maybe can put some words to it, okay, this morning. And so that's what we're going to do for the next few minutes, is answer this question, and we'll come back and end in prayer. All right. All right. Well, let's bring it back together. Hope y'all had, again, some good discussion. Again, I didn't see any chairs fly. Except, yes, Jeff?
I have a question about the list.
Okay.
I didn't read the other book. Is that list in an order?
Like specifically, like that's... No, they're not listed in they're not in that order because, you know, they're ranked somehow or something like that. If that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, no, so he talks about, so these are, it's like an axis, right? It's like a continuum. So, you know, care on one side, harm on the other. Yeah, but there's not like a hierarchy of them, if that makes sense. So. I mean, that's a really interesting observation. Yeah. Now he does talk about, actually, I mean, you bring a good point up, actually. So he does talk about in the book how different cultures do rank those differently. So, for instance, we could have a discussion about if you had to rank these in terms of what are sort of more important to a Christian, maybe. You could maybe do that. But he does talk about how different cultures prioritize some of these differently. And there's a bunch of really interesting studies he did with folks from all over the world, where some cultures, the idea of, for instance, sanctity and degradation are obviously very different based on different religious backgrounds and beliefs, but how some of these other ones, like loyalty and betrayal, can be defined very differently in different cultures. And so how they might put a priority on fairness and cheating, but somehow loyalty and betrayal they see differently. And that, anyway. So it's worth reading the book, actually, because he doesn't rank them himself, but it's clear in different contexts, different ones are prioritized over others. So, anyway. But, well, good. Well, thank y'all for bearing with me today on that. I don't think that was too painful. We didn't get into anything too bad. But it is important, right? We do have a tendency, and I think there is a really big emphasis, culturally certainly, on politics as being a place not just of kind of where our important convictions go to embody themselves, but also a place of salvation. And And I've seen that, like I said, even in the life of the church. I remember, so back in this is where I'll end today. We'll wrap with prayer. But back in, I guess it would have been 2016, I was on the schedule to preach Christ the King Sunday, okay, which is in November, all right? And obviously, election season 2016, a little heated, right? We were running a little hot that year. And I was in Florida at the time, which was a very contested place to be in every election, but that was a very contested place to be. And so my Christ the King sermon was just trying to bring the temperature down a little bit. And I just said, guys, my one point was we need to remember Christ is on the throne. Whoever we vote for, it is important, okay? But at the end of the day, our allegiance is not here. It's to God, and let's just all remember that, right? Like, let's just keep that at front of mind. And on the way out of church, I got people complaining about that. And thank you guys, I very rarely get complaints, even after bad sermons. Even after sermons that I know were not good, people will still very politely shake my hand and go, thank you for that. I know what that means, okay, but that's fine, that's fine. You don't hit it out of the park every week. But that is one of literally the only times in the receiving line after church people have complained about a sermon that I gave. And in that moment I thought, oh boy, we are in trouble. If that is a controversial proclamation from the pulpit, we are in for quite a ride. And so, so I do think this is important for us to contemplate, think about, reflect on in the life of the church. And so, anyway, because it is a thing that we face and a dynamic that we face. So.
That's why in the Episcopal Church we preach on the Scripture.
Yes, yeah.
Preaching on the news of the day.
Yes, yeah.
Bring in an example from the news.
That's right.
To be a descriptor of what
Yes.
the Scripture is talking about.
Yeah, our service itself is set up that way, right? That we read not just one tiny passage each week, right? But we read Old Testament, Psalm, New Testament, Gospel lesson every single Sunday. And I could get up there and preach the most absolute stinker of a sermon ever. And you know what happens right after I get out? We say the creed to save ourselves, okay? From whatever mess the preacher may get into, and then we gather around the table. I think you're right. I mean, I think the whole structure of our worship life is to help us guard against some of this sometimes. But yeah, so that's good. Well, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, I thank you so much for your church, as messy as it can be sometimes. I thank you for the gift of relationships, for the way that they help stretch us and challenge us and help us to grow. I thank you that we do not work out our salvation alone in isolation, but actually do it together as part of a community of faith. And I pray that as we here at St. Richard's seek to discern how to live that out, that we would do so always in the light of your Holy Spirit, that you would guide us and guard us in all that we do, that you would bind us together in mutual love and charity, and that we would be, through that love, a witness for our community and the world. We pray all of these things in your name. Amen. All right, well, thank you, guys. We'll conclude next week by talking about seculosity in the church, and then we'll be at Easter after that. So, all right.